There is a nest in the Badlands of Montana that changes everything. It was found in 1978 by a fossil hunter named Marion Brandvold, pressed into a hillside of 77-million-year-old rock. And when the paleontologist Jack Horner knelt beside it in the summer heat and began brushing away the matrix, what he uncovered was not just bones. It was an argument against everything science had assumed about dinosaurs for 100 years. Because inside that shallow stone bowl, about 1 meter across, were the remains of 15 baby hadrosaurs. They were half-grown. Their teeth were worn from use. Their limb bones, still soft at the ends, had not yet hardened into the dense architecture of animals capable of walking long distances on their own. And yet, they were there, still in the nest, still together, long after the age when most reptiles would have scattered to fend for themselves. Someone had been feeding them. Someone had been coming back. That nest, and the dozens that followed from the same site, would eventually be named Egg Mountain, a place that rewrote the story of dinosaur behavior so completely that the old image, the cold-blooded loner, the creature that laid its eggs and walked away, the animal whose young entered the world already abandoned, had to be set aside entirely. What replaced it was something that no one had imagined when the first dinosaur bones were pulled from the earth in the 19th century. What replaced it was a picture of animals that, in some cases at least, stayed. That built nests with care. That returned. That guarded and fed and perhaps even called to their young across the noise of the late Cretaceous world. What replaced it, in other words, was something that looks startlingly like parenthood. Tonight, we're going to go somewhere that is simultaneously very far away and very close. We are going to walk into the deep past, into a world that existed before our own by a span of time so enormous that the entire history of our species, from the first stone tools to the satellites now circling overhead, fits inside it the way a single afternoon fits inside the age of the universe. We are going to stand at the edge of a dinosaur nesting ground and try to understand what was happening there. Not just the biology of it, not just the mechanics of eggs and embryos and calcium and incubation, but the behavior. The choice, if we can call it that, to stay. The instinct, or something that looked like instinct, to return. The ancient, pre-human, pre-mammalian fact of an animal caring, in some form, for the life it made. This is a story that has been rewritten 3 times in the last 50 years, and it is still being rewritten now. Every new nest, every fossilized embryo, every trace of an ancient brooding posture locked in stone adds another layer to something that was invisible to science until very recently. And the reason it was invisible is worth understanding, because it tells us something about how we see animals we have never seen alive, how we project our assumptions onto them, how we read the bones wrong for generations before we finally began to read them right. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. I am always curious to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you have not already, take a deep breath, and let the modern world fade away. To understand why dinosaur parenting was invisible for so long, you have to understand what the word dinosaur meant in science for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. When Richard Owen coined the term in 1842, he was describing a group of animals that were, in his conception, essentially large reptile-like creatures, scaly and cold-blooded, and fundamentally alien to the warm, social, nurturing mammals he and his contemporaries understood best. The first dinosaur reconstructions, Iguanodon standing upright like a stout elephant, Megalosaurus lumbering on 4 legs like a crocodile swollen to monstrous size, reflected this framework perfectly. These were creatures from another world, another biology, another set of behavioral possibilities. The idea that they might have sat on their eggs, or carried food back to a nest, or called to their young with something like recognition, simply did not fit the template. This framework was not unreasonable given what was known at the time. The animals most closely related to dinosaurs that were still living, or at least the ones most people thought of as related, were crocodilians and lizards and snakes. And while crocodilians, as we now know, are actually remarkably attentive parents, that knowledge came later. For most of the history of paleontology, the dominant model for dinosaur reproduction was essentially what you see in a sea turtle. Dig a hole, deposit the eggs, cover them up, and leave. The eggs hatch on their own, the young are independent from the moment they emerge, and the parent is already gone, already somewhere else, already concerned with nothing except its own survival. This is called precocial development, and it is widespread among reptiles. It requires no nest attendance, no feeding, no recognition between parent and offspring. It is, in the most literal sense possible, reproduction without parenting. The fossil records seem to support this. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, dinosaur eggs were rare and fragmentary. They had been found in France, in Mongolia, in a few scattered localities, but they were usually broken and isolated, unaccompanied by the behavioral context that would tell you anything about what the living animal had done with them. An egg alone tells you almost nothing. It tells you that an animal laid it. It does not tell you whether that animal then walked away or stayed. The first hint that something more complicated might have been happening came from an unexpected source, and from an unlikely place, and from a man who had no formal degree in paleontology, but who had spent more time in the Montana Badlands than most tenured professors had spent in any field at all. Roy Chapman Andrews had found dinosaur eggs in the Gobi Desert in the 1920s. Enormous clutches of Protoceratops eggs arranged in careful spirals, and this was significant. The arrangement was deliberate. These were not eggs that had rolled randomly from a disturbed body. They had been placed. But the implications of that placement, what it said about the animal that made those arrangements, were not pursued with the urgency they deserved. It took another 50 years, and the work of Jack Horner and his colleague Bob McKellar in a Montana sheep rancher's rock shop to force the question into the open in a way that could not be ignored. The rock shop belonged to a woman named Marion Brandvold, and she had been setting aside curious fossils for years. When Horner and McKellar visited in the summer of 1978, she showed them a coffee can full of tiny bones. They were the bones of baby dinosaurs. Hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, the great herding animals of the late Cretaceous. The ones whose fossils crowd the badlands of Montana and Alberta in enormous numbers. But these were not adult bones. They were small and fragile and clearly juvenile. And when Horner followed the trail back to where they had come from, he found the nest that would eventually give Egg Mountain its name. What made that nest extraordinary was not simply its existence, it was its contents. The babies inside it were not hatchlings. They were roughly half the size of an adult, suggesting that they had been in or near the nest for months after hatching. And their teeth, as mentioned, were worn. Worn teeth on a young animal mean one thing. It had been eating. It had been chewing plant material, processing food, consuming a diet that someone had to bring it. Because half-grown hadrosaurs with underdeveloped limbs are not capable of foraging for themselves across the landscape. The food came from somewhere. The food came from someone who kept returning to that nest, kept providing, kept the young alive through the long, slow months of their early development. Horner named the dinosaur Maiasaura, from the Greek meaning good mother lizard. It was a name that contained an interpretation, a statement about behavior embedded in taxonomy, which is unusual in science, but Horner felt it was earned. The evidence at Egg Mountain, once the site had been more fully excavated over the following years, was overwhelming. There were multiple nests, arranged at roughly adult body length intervals from each other, suggesting a colonial nesting ground, a place where multiple females returned year after year to lay their eggs. There were eggs at various stages of development, There were hatchlings still curled in the egg posture. There were juveniles of the half-grown size. And there was evidence in the form of crushed eggshells scattered across the base of the nest bowl that young animals had been moving around inside that nest for a long time after hatching, their movements grinding the shells into fragments. A sea turtle nest does not look like this. A sea turtle nest is intact until the moment the hatchlings emerge, and then it is empty. The Maiasaura nests were full of the evidence of occupancy, of weeks and months of residency, of a life lived in one place while something was being built. The question that followed from Egg Mountain was not simply whether Maiasaura cared for its young. The evidence there was strong enough to make a case. The question was how widespread this behavior was. Was Maiasaura exceptional, an evolutionary outlier in a group of otherwise absent parents? Or was it representative of something broader, something woven through the biology of dinosaurs as a whole? And that question, it turned out, had an answer. It just took decades more to find it, and it required looking not just at the nests, but at the eggs themselves, at the embryos inside them, at the bone chemistry of hatchlings and juveniles, and eventually at the behavior of the living descendants of dinosaurs, the birds, whose nesting and parenting behavior we can observe directly, and whose evolutionary roots run straight back into the Mesozoic. The story of dinosaur parenting is, in this sense, also a story about evolution. It is a story about where parental care comes from, why it exists at all in a biological universe that is largely indifferent to the fate of individual organisms, what survival pressures might have pushed certain lineages toward the investment and the vulnerability that raising young requires. To understand why some dinosaurs stayed, you have to understand what staying costs, and that cost is considerable. Parental care is not free. It is not a soft, sentimental addition to the business of reproduction, a nicety layered on top of the basic drive to pass genes forward. It is an enormous investment of time and energy and risk. An animal that tends a nest is an animal that stays in one place, and an animal that stays in one place is an animal that predators can find. An animal that feeds its young is an animal that expends calories on offspring rather than on its own growth and maintenance. An animal that guards eggs against temperature fluctuations or rain or nest parasites or egg-stealing theropods is an animal whose attention is divided, whose vigilance is split, whose life is shaped for weeks or months by the demands of something that cannot yet survive on its own. Why would natural selection favor this? The answer is the same answer that explains the existence of parental care in every lineage where it appears, from nesting birds to nursing mammals to brooding fish. It appears when the benefit to offspring survival outweighs the cost to parental survival and future reproduction. When the world is dangerous enough, when hatchlings are vulnerable enough, when independent young have low enough survival rates, then the genes that build parents who stay and tend and feed are the genes that persist. The genes that build parents who walk away are the genes that watch their offspring die. Over enough generations, the math is simple. The stayers win. But the math only works in specific ecological conditions. Those conditions do not always exist. Sea turtles lay enormous clutches of eggs precisely because most of those eggs will never produce a surviving adult. The strategy is volume. Lay 100, get 2 that make it. In that world, staying near the nest accomplishes nothing, because the threats are diffuse and the predators are everywhere, and no amount of parental vigilance can change the fundamental calculus of a hatchling's odds on a beach at night. The sea turtle's strategy is not worse than the bird's strategy. It is appropriate to a different world, a different set of challenges, a different relationship between investment and outcome. Dinosaurs occupied both kinds of worlds. They occupied a vast range of ecological niches, from the floodplains of Western North America to the high-latitude forests of Antarctica, from the arid deserts of Central Asia to the lush river deltas of what is now Europe. Some of them were the size of chickens and some were the size of buildings. Some of them ate plants, and some ate other dinosaurs, and some almost certainly ate whatever they could find. This diversity means that no single statement about dinosaur parenting can be true for all dinosaurs. What is true is that parental care evolved in this group, probably more than once, probably in multiple independent lineages, and that the evidence for it, once scientists knew what to look for, began turning up everywhere. Let us go to the Gobi Desert. Let us go there in the late Cretaceous, roughly 75 million years ago, to a landscape that looked nothing like it does today. The modern Gobi is one of the most arid places on Earth. A cold, high-altitude desert of gravel plains and Saxel scrub and dust storms that arrive in spring with the force of weather systems. But 75 million years ago, this was a place of seasonal rains and dry forests and river systems that spread across what is now southern Mongolia and northern China in a web of temporary lakes and braided channels. It was a world of sand dunes too, great ergs of windblown sediment that preserved fossils with unusual completeness, burying animals where they died or where they nested, sealing them in sand that would eventually become the red and orange sandstone of the Jadokta Formation, the rock unit that has produced more complete small dinosaur specimens than almost anywhere else on Earth. It is here, in this ancient desert, that one of the most dramatic parenting stories in the fossil record was preserved. Not a nest of hadrosaurs with worn teeth and crushed eggshell. Something stranger, and in its own way, more immediate. An oviraptorid, a theropod dinosaur related to the ancestors of birds, found in a posture that was, at first, deeply misread. The story of the oviraptor begins with a mistake. When Roy Chapman Andrews and his team from the American Museum of Natural History excavated the Jadokta Formation in the 1920s, they found the skull of a toothless theropod dinosaur sitting directly on top of a clutch of eggs. They assumed, reasonably given everything they knew, that the animal had been caught in the act of stealing those eggs. After all, what else would an adult dinosaur be doing sitting on top of a nest that was not its own? The skull was damaged, the circumstances were suggestive, and the name they gave the animal sealed the interpretation into taxonomy for 70 years. Oviraptor Philoceratops, the egg thief who loves ceratopsians. The assumption was that the eggs belonged to Protoceratops, a small horned dinosaur common at the same sites, and that the toothless theropod had been raiding the nest when it died. The name stuck. The image stuck. For decades, Oviraptor appeared in museum displays and textbooks as a nest robber, a villain of the Cretaceous, an animal whose very name announced its crime. And then, in 1993, a team led by the paleontologist Mark Norell from the American Museum of Natural History discovered something that overturned everything. At a site called Ukar Tolgod in the Gobi, they found an oviraptorid dinosaur in a posture that could only be described as brooding. The animal was crouched low over a nest of eggs, its arms spread wide, its legs tucked beneath its body, its weight distributed in a way that placed its torso directly over the clutch. It was, in almost every structural detail, the posture of a modern bird sitting on its eggs. The implications were enormous. If this oviraptorid was brooding its own eggs, then the original oviraptor specimen was not stealing eggs at all. It was tending its own nest when it died, killed perhaps by a sudden sandstorm, the same kind of catastrophic sand event that had buried so many animals at Jadokta Formation sites with such unusual completeness. The eggs the original specimen was found with were not Protoceratops eggs. They were oviraptorid eggs. The animal had been framed for a crime it did not commit, named for a behavior it never displayed, for 70 years of scientific literature. Norell's discovery did not simply rehabilitate the reputation of one dinosaur. It opened a window onto a much larger question. If oviraptorids were brooding their eggs, if they were sitting on them in the bird posture, with arms spread and body lowered over the clutch, then what were they doing with their body heat? Birds brood because they are warm-blooded. because their body temperature is consistently high enough to warm the eggs around them, to keep the embryos inside those eggs developing at the rate their biology demands. Cold-blooded animals do not brood in this sense. A crocodile warms its nest with decomposing vegetation and solar heat, and the careful management of shade and exposure. It does not sit on the eggs. It cannot, because its body temperature fluctuates with the environment and would provide no reliable warmth. The oviraptorid's brooding posture suggested an animal whose physiology was fundamentally different from the cold-blooded reptile of the old imagining. It suggested warmth. This connects to a revolution in our understanding of dinosaur physiology that had been building since the 1970s, largely through the work of the paleontologist Robert Baker, whose book, The Dinosaur Heresies, published in 1986, made the case for warm-blooded, fast-moving, behaviorally complex dinosaurs to a wide popular audience. Baker was not always right in his details, and his style was polemical enough to generate significant opposition within the field. But the core argument, that dinosaurs were not the sluggish, cold-blooded reptiles of the traditional reconstruction, that their bone structure and their evolutionary relationships and the ecological roles they filled all pointed toward animals with elevated metabolic rates, was substantially correct. Subsequent decades of research on bone histology, on isotopic analysis of fossil teeth, on the discovery of feathered dinosaur specimens from China, have moved the consensus steadily toward a view of many dinosaurs as metabolically active, fast-growing, physiologically sophisticated animals that occupied a range on the spectrum between the cold-blooded and the warm-blooded that does not map neatly onto any modern category. The brooding oviraptorids fit this picture perfectly. An animal that sits on its eggs in the bird posture, that spreads its arms over the clutch and lowers its body to shield them, is an animal that is doing something functional with its own body heat. And the nest structure of oviraptorids supports this interpretation. Their nests, where enough of the egg arrangement is preserved to study, show the eggs arranged in a ring or a partial ring, with an open space in the center. This arrangement is significant. In modern birds that brood by sitting directly on the eggs are beneath the bird's body and are warmed by direct contact. But in large oviraptorids, the clutches are too wide for a single animal to cover completely. The ring arrangement with the center open suggests an animal that sat in the middle of the ring, warming the inner edges of the eggs with its body, while perhaps using its arms and whatever feathery covering they bore to insulate the outer edges. Some paleontologists have described this as an intermediate brooding strategy, not quite as efficient as a modern bird's direct contact brooding, but far more active and thermoregulatory than any crocodilian nest management. It is a behavior that tells you something about where these animals sat on the spectrum between the fully ectothermic and the fully endothermic. The feathers matter here. Oviraptorids, and indeed most members of the Coelurosaur group of theropods to which they belong, had feathers. We know this not from direct evidence on most specimens, because feathers rarely fossilize, but from the extraordinary Yixian Formation fossils of northeastern China, where exquisite preservation conditions captured the feather impressions of dozens of theropod species in the first years of the 21st century. The feathered theropods of China showed the scientific world that plumage was ancient and widespread among the small and medium-sized dinosaurs of the Coelurosaur lineage. Animals like Caudipteryx and Microraptor and Anchiornis had elaborate feathers covering their bodies and arms and tails. Feathers that could not have been used for flight in most of these species, but that served other functions: insulation, display, brooding, or some combination of all three. An oviraptorid brooding its eggs with feathered arms is not a strange image once you accept that those arms were feathered. It is, instead, an image of something ancient performing a behavior that is alive in the world today every time a chicken settles onto a clutch of eggs in a henhouse. But let us not move too quickly past the eggs themselves, because the eggs are their own extraordinary record, and what they contain, and what their chemistry tells us adds another dimension to the story of dinosaur parenting that goes beyond behavior and into the hidden biology of the animals that made them. Dinosaur eggs are not all alike. This sounds obvious, but the range of variation in dinosaur egg structure is striking and scientifically meaningful. Eggs differ in size, in shape, in the texture of the outer shell, in the internal structure of the shell itself, as seen under a microscope, and in the color of the pigments deposited in the shell calcium. Some of these differences are simply taxonomic, reflections of the deep evolutionary divergence between different dinosaur lineages. But some of them are behavioral and ecological signals, marks left in the egg's architecture by the reproductive strategy of the animal that made it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Consider shell porosity. The pores in an eggshell are the channels through which oxygen reaches the developing embryo and carbon dioxide escapes. In a buried nest, a nest where the eggs are covered with sand or decomposing vegetation and there is no airflow across the surface, the pores need to be numerous and large because the embryo must be able to exchange gases through a thick medium of earth. In an open nest, a nest where the eggs are exposed to air and the parent's body provides warmth but not burial, the pores can be smaller and less numerous because gas exchange happens directly with the atmosphere. When paleontologists measure the pore structure of fossil eggshells, they can make inferences about whether the nest was open or buried, which in turn tells them something about whether the eggs were actively tended or left to incubate on their own. The work of the paleontologist Frankie Jackson and her colleagues in analysing eggshell pore structure has produced results that map reasonably well onto what behavioural evidence suggests. Large, heavily buried sauropod eggs, the enormous eggs of the long-necked giants that were among the largest animals to walk the earth, tend to show pore structures consistent with burial in open, well-ventilated sediment, not with active brooding. The eggs of small oviraptorids and troodonts, the bird-like theropods whose brooding behaviour is best supported by fossil posture evidence, tend to show pore structures more consistent with open-air incubation, with the kind of environment you would expect around a parent that was sitting on or near the eggs and allowing air to circulate freely. This is, it should be said, an inference built on inference, and the uncertainties compound. Eggshell pore structure can be affected by diagenesis, the chemical changes that happen to rock over millions of years, and distinguishing original pore structure from diagenetic alteration requires careful analysis. But the broad pattern holds across enough specimens and enough independent lines of evidence that it has become a genuine part of the argument for behavioral diversity in dinosaur reproduction. The chemistry of the shell itself adds another layer. In 2021, a remarkable study led by Jasmina Wieman at Yale University analysed the eggshells of fossil dinosaurs and extinct birds using a technique called Raman spectroscopy, which detects the molecular signatures of organic pigments even in material that is millions of years old. The results were extraordinary. Oviraptorid eggshells showed the molecular signatures of protoporphyrin and biliverdin, the same pigments that colour the eggs of modern birds. Specifically, they showed the combination of pigments that produces blue-green eggs, not solid white or pale and uniform, but blue-green, the colour of a modern tinamou egg or certain thrush eggs. The sauropod eggshells examined in the same study showed no such pigments. Their eggs were, as far as the chemistry can tell, white. This difference is behaviourally significant. White eggs are typically found in species that bury their eggs or nest in enclosed spaces where camouflage serves no purpose. Coloured and patterned eggs are typically found in open nesting species, where camouflage against a visually complex environment matters, or in species with recognisable clutch patterns that allow parents to identify their own eggs or to identify foreign eggs laid in their nests by brood parasites. The blue-green oviraptorid eggs are not proof of brooding on their own, but they are consistent with it. They are the eggs of an animal that incubated in the open, where egg color mattered for some reason, whether camouflage, individual recognition, or something else entirely. They are not the eggs of an animal that buried its clutch under a meter of sand and walked away. The sauropod eggs being white fits the evidence for sauropod nesting behavior in a different direction. Sauropods were enormous. The largest of them, the titanosaurs of the late Cretaceous, reached lengths of 30 meters or more and weights that may have exceeded 70 metric tons. These were the largest land animals that have ever lived. Creatures whose mass was so great that they could not have sat on their eggs without crushing them, and whose body temperature, if elevated at all above the ambient, was probably maintained more by their sheer bulk than by the kind of active thermogenesis seen in small, feathered theropods. The sauropod reproductive strategy, as best we can reconstruct it, was closer to the sea turtle end of the spectrum. Dig a pit, deposit an enormous clutch of eggs, fill the pit, and trust the warmth of the ground and the slow chemistry of decomposing vegetation to do the work of incubation. Yet even in sauropods, the evidence resists the cleanest version of the absent parent story. In 2005, a team working at a site called Auca Mahuevo in Patagonia, Argentina, published a study of titanosaur nesting grounds that showed something unexpected. Auca Mahuevo is one of the most remarkable paleontological sites in the world, a place where, in the dry hills of the Neuquén province, the eroding rock is so full of titanosaur eggs that they crunch underfoot if you are not paying attention. Hundreds of thousands of eggs, distributed across an area of several square kilometers, all from the same geological horizon, all from what appears to have been a single, enormous nesting aggregation of titanosaur sauropods that returned to this location repeatedly over many years or many generations. The eggs at Auca Mahuevo, excavated by Luis Chiappe of the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and Lowell Dingus of the American Museum of Natural History, contained embryos preserved with extraordinary detail, some of them showing skin impressions, the bumpy, rounded scales that covered the bodies of these animals in the egg. These embryos allowed the researchers to confirm the identity of the nesting animals and to study the developmental stage at which they died. But beyond the embryos, the site itself told a behavioral story. The concentration of nesting activity in a single location, repeated across time, is a signal of colonial nesting behavior. The same behavior seen at Egg Mountain with Maiasaura. The behavior of an animal that returns to a specific place to lay its eggs, not randomly distributed across the landscape, but aggregated in a colony. Colonial nesting is interesting from a parental care perspective, because it suggests that there was a selective advantage to nesting in groups, even if individual parents did not tend individual nests. Group nesting can reduce predation risk through the simple arithmetic of dilution. The more nests in one place, the lower the probability that any individual clutch is the one that gets raided on any given night. It can also allow for some collective defense, with multiple large adults in proximity creating a deterrent to smaller predators. And it can reflect site fidelity, the return of the same individuals to the same location year after year, which in modern animals is associated with learned knowledge about nesting conditions, about predator pressure, about the microhabitat features that make one spot better than another. Did titanosaur parents stay near Auca Mahuevo after depositing their eggs? The evidence does not say so directly. No adult titanosaur skeleton has been found associated with the nests in a way that suggests attendance. But the clustering, the site fidelity, the sheer scale of the nesting aggregation, these are behaviors that go beyond simple egg dumping. Something was drawing these animals back. Something was concentrating their reproduction in one place. And whatever that something was, it was not random. The theropods are where the parenting story becomes most complex and most surprising. Because among theropods, the large clade of bipedal predatory dinosaurs that includes everything from the tiny Compsognathus to the enormous Tyrannosaurus rex, the evidence for parental care is varied, sometimes ambiguous, and in at least one case, points toward a pattern of care that overturns assumptions in the opposite direction from what most people would expect. Most people, when they think about parental care in birds, think about the mother. Mothers sit on eggs, mothers feed chicks, mothers are the ones who stay. This is a reasonable intuition because in many familiar bird species, the female does the majority of the incubation and care. But it is not a universal rule, even in modern birds. In ostriches, the dominant male incubates the eggs overnight. In emus, males incubate exclusively for about 8 weeks without eating. In cassowaries, males raise the chicks entirely alone after the female departs. In rheas, males incubate and care for the young, while females move on to mate with other males. And in many shorebirds and wading birds, males are the primary or exclusive caregivers. This diversity in avian parental roles is not random. It reflects evolutionary history, phylogenetic inertia, the way that care systems, once established in a lineage, tend to persist even as other aspects of the biology change. And among the theropod dinosaurs that gave rise to birds, there is now evidence that male-dominated or exclusive male care was the ancestral condition, not a derived innovation of a few specialized lineages. The evidence comes from a study published in 2008 by the paleontologist David Verricchio of Montana State University and his colleagues, who examined the clutch volumes of several theropod species, including Troodon formosus, Oviraptor philoceratops, and Cytipati osmolsky, a large oviraptorid from Mongolia. The question they asked was deceptively simple. How big is the clutch relative to the body size of the animal? In modern birds, clutch volume relative to female body size is a rough proxy for whether the female alone is laying all the eggs, or whether multiple females are contributing to a single clutch. Female birds that lay all the eggs in a clutch alone tend to have clutch volumes that scale consistently with their body size. Species where multiple females lay in the same nest, or where females lay in multiple nests, show different scaling patterns. The theropod clutches, when analysed this way, showed clutch volumes that were much too large to have been produced by a single female. The eggs were too many, the total volume too great to have come from one individual. This suggested that multiple females were contributing eggs to a single nest, exactly the pattern seen in certain ratites and other modern birds where males are the primary caregivers. In these systems, the male maintains a nest territory and accepts eggs from multiple females, incubating them all, because the male's reproductive success depends on how many eggs he can successfully hatch, not on exclusive pair bonding with a single mate. The females, freed from the cost of incubation, can invest more energy in egg production and can mate with multiple males, increasing their total reproductive output. If this interpretation is correct, and Verricchio's analysis is supported by the brooding postures found in the fossil record, male oviraptorids were sitting on eggs produced by multiple females. The brooding individual found at Ukar Tolgod, the one who died with its arms spread over the nest, was almost certainly male. The feathered, attentive parent of the late Cretaceous goby was a father. This is not entirely surprising when you consider the broader evolutionary context. Among living archosaurs, the group that includes both crocodilians and birds, parental care is actually the rule rather than the exception. Crocodilians, the closest living relatives of dinosaurs along with birds, are remarkable parents by reptile standards. The female American alligator builds a mound nest of vegetation and mud, guards it ferociously for about 65 days of incubation, responds to the vocalizations of hatching young by opening the nest, carries hatchlings to the water in her mouth, and guards the social group of young, called a pod, for up to 2 years after hatching. The male is less involved in most crocodilian species, but in some, like the saltwater crocodile, both parents guard the nest. This level of parental investment in a group as ancient as crocodilians suggests that parental care was present deep in the Archosaur lineage, before the split between the crocodile and bird lineages, before the first dinosaur walked the earth. Troodon formosus, a small, large-brained theropod from the late Cretaceous of western North America, provides one of the most detailed pictures of non-avian dinosaur nesting behavior. Because its nests are known from multiple sites across Montana and Alberta, and because the egg arrangement in those nests is unusually informative. Troodon eggs were laid in pairs, partially buried in the substrate at an angle, with the upper portions protruding from the sediment. This arrangement is similar to the nesting style of some modern birds, including certain ground nesting species that partially bury their eggs in sand or soil. The pair-laying pattern suggests that each egg was laid with a significant gap between them, perhaps days apart, and that the arrangement of the clutch was deliberate, the result of an animal that was thinking, in some behavioral sense, about where each egg went. The nest sites themselves are found in what were once floodplain deposits, areas that would have been periodically inundated, and that offered the combination of soft substrate suitable for partial burial and the warmth of dark, wet sediment. Troodon appears to have been a communal nester, with multiple adults laying eggs in a relatively small area, much like modern colonial nesters. The size of Troodon's brain, which was among the largest relative to body size of any non-avian dinosaur, has long made it a subject of speculation about behavioral complexity. A large brain is not proof of sophisticated behavior, but it is consistent with the learning and flexible response that complex nesting and parenting behaviors require. Now, let us go somewhere warmer and brighter and noisier. Let us go to the nesting ground itself in the middle of the season. Let us try to hear it. It is late spring in what will eventually become Montana, 66 million years ago. The floodplain of a broad river system spreads wide to the west, where the young Rocky Mountains are still rising, their slopes dark with conifer forest. The air is warm and humid and smells of the river, of mud and standing water, and the faint sweetness of flowering plants that are still, in evolutionary terms, a relatively new presence in the world. Angiosperms, the flowering plants, have been diversifying rapidly for the past 30 million years, and the landscape here reflects that diversification, a patchwork of conifers and ferns and cycads, punctuated by the broader-leafed, softer-textured presence of the flowering plants that will eventually come to dominate the world's vegetation. The nesting ground is a low ridge of packed, damp earth above the floodplain, and it is loud. Not loud in the way we might imagine a dinosaur world being loud. Not the roar of theropod predators or the crash of enormous bodies through vegetation. The loudest sound right now is the sound of air moving through grass and low scrub, and beneath that, the sounds of the animals themselves. The Maiasaura here are big. An adult female stands 3 to 4 meters high at the hip, 7 to 8 meters long, a bulk of several metric tons, and she moves with a deliberateness that large animals always have, a quality of weight and intention combined. Her coloring is muted, dark green on the back, fading to a duller brown at the sides, with a faint ridge of scaled skin running along the spine. Her eyes are set wide and high on her long, flat skull, giving her a wide field of view across the nesting ground. She has been away for perhaps an hour. She left the nest in the early morning to feed, moving out onto the floodplain where stands of horsetail and fern fronds are thick enough to browse efficiently. She needed to eat. She has been spending enormous energy in the past weeks, laying eggs, building and shaping the nest bowl, returning repeatedly to check on it, calling in low-resonant vocalizations to the young inside the eggs when they are close enough to hatching that they can hear her through the shell. Now she is moving back toward the nest with the fluid, rolling gait of a large hadrosaur, her body slightly low, her attention already focused on the bowl of earth ahead of her. The nest is still intact. No predators have come while she was gone, though the tracks of something smaller, perhaps a small coelurosaur, approach within a few meters before turning away. The eggs are warm. The 3 that have already hatched are inside the nest, small and soft-boned, their eyes large and dark, their bodies covered with fine scales that will coarsen as they grow. They make sounds when she arrives, not complex vocalizations, not language, but sounds, a rising soft trill that seems to function as a contact call, a signal of presence and need. She responds with a lower, slower sound from somewhere in her chest, and the young animals quiet and shift toward her. This scene is a reconstruction necessarily. We cannot hear the Cretaceous. We cannot see the colors of animals dead for 66 million years. But the bones and the nests and the chemistry of the eggshells give us the outlines of something real. And the outlines are clear enough to fill in with the logic of biology. The behavior is real. The caring is real. The nest is real. What we add is detail, and the detail is consistent with everything the evidence says about how these animals lived. The development of the young inside those eggs, before they hatched, is a story that can now be told in more detail than would have seemed possible even 30 years ago. Fossil embryos have been found for many dinosaur species, and the study of their internal structure, particularly their bone histology, the microscopic architecture of bone tissue laid down as the embryo grew, has provided a window into developmental rates and developmental strategies that was entirely closed before modern microscopy and analytical chemistry made these studies possible. Bone histology in dinosaurs works on a principle that applies to all vertebrates. Bone is not laid down uniformly as an animal grows. It is deposited in layers, with different layers reflecting different periods of faster or slower growth. In modern birds, which grow very rapidly after hatching, the bone tissue laid down during the first weeks and months of life is dense with the vascular channels that supply blood to rapidly multiplying bone cells, a tissue type called fibrolamellar bone, which is the signature of fast growth. In crocodilians, which grow more slowly and show a strong seasonal pattern of growth and rest, the bone often shows growth rings, lines of arrested growth, similar to tree rings, that mark the annual cycle of the animal's life. In dinosaurs, both patterns are found, depending on the species and the age of the individual. The embryos of Maiasaura, studied in detail by the paleontologist Gregory Erickson of Florida State University and his colleagues, show bone histology consistent with a rapid growth trajectory after hatching, with fibrolamellar bone throughout the early developmental stages. This is significant because it means Maiasaura young, once they hatched, were growing fast, very fast. At the same time, their bones at hatching were still relatively soft and incompletely ossified, meaning the ends of the limb bones, the growth plates where bone elongation happens, were still cartilaginous rather than fully calcified. An animal with soft, incompletely ossified limb bones is an animal that cannot walk efficiently. It is an animal that is built by its own biology to stay in one place while it finishes growing. The bones tell the same story the worn teeth tell. These animals were in the nest because their bodies were not yet ready to be anywhere else. The growth rate implied by the bone histology is extraordinary by modern reptile standards, but comparable to modern birds. Erickson's work and subsequent studies using more refined methods suggest that Maiasaura young went from hatchling size, roughly 45 centimeters long, to about 1.5 meters in their first year, and to near adult size, 7 to 8 meters, in roughly 6 to 8 years. This is a growth trajectory that is closer to a large bird than to any living reptile. An American alligator of the same starting size would take 30 years to reach comparable dimensions. The fast growth of Maiasaura young meant that the period of dependency was relatively short on evolutionary timescales, but intense, demanding, and real. The question of what exactly the parents were bringing to feed the young at Egg Mountain is one that the fossil record cannot answer directly. We do not have preserved stomach contents from Maiasaura chicks that tell us their diet was supplemented by adult-provided food. What we have is the inference from the worn teeth and the underdeveloped limbs. The young were eating, and they were not foraging for themselves. So something was bringing food to the nest. What that food was is a matter of reasonable inference. Hadrosaurs were herbivores, and the vegetation of the late Cretaceous floodplain included ferns, horsetails, flowering plants, and the softer portions of conifer branches. Adult Maiasaura could crop and perhaps partially process vegetation, and regurgitating softened plant material to nestlings is not an unknown behavior in modern bird species that are herbivores or mixed feeders. The mechanic, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The mechanics of how a 7-meter hadrosaur might have delivered food to nest-bound young without trampling them is an interesting puzzle that the fossil record leaves open. But the basic fact of provisioning is well supported. Among the small ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous, a different kind of parenting evidence has emerged, and it is arguably the most intimate, the most emotionally immediate of all the dinosaur parenting stories. In 2011, the paleontologist David Fastovsky of the University of Rhode Island and his colleagues described a specimen from the Jadokta Formation of Mongolia that has become one of the most discussed fossils in the literature on dinosaur social behavior. It is a single rock slab containing the remains of an adult Protoceratops andrewsi and 6 juvenile Protoceratops of varying sizes, all apparently associated in a way that suggests they were together when they died. The juveniles, ranging from very young hatchlings to older but still subadult individuals, are arranged around and beneath the adult in a way that is not consistent with random association. They are too close together, too organized in their spatial arrangement to have accumulated by chance. The most likely interpretation is that this was a family group caught together in a sudden burial event, the kind of catastrophic sandstorm that the Jadokta Formation records with such frequency. If so, then the adult was attending a group of young animals of different ages, which suggests either that multiple seasons worth of offspring were being kept together, or that Protoceratops raised its young in communal family groups, where different cohorts of juveniles overlapped in their period of association with adults. This is behavior that, in modern animals, is associated with high parental investment and relatively slow juvenile development. Animals that keep young of different ages together around adults are animals whose young require extended care, extended learning, extended protection. Protoceratops was not a large animal. An adult was roughly 1.5 meters long and weighed perhaps 175 kilograms. It was a plant eater of the scrubby desert environments of the Cretaceous Gobi, and it was prey for the same animals, including Velociraptor, that hunted the same landscape. The value of a family group in that context, the value of multiple adults and older juveniles providing vigilance, alarm behavior, even collective defense against a predator that hunted by surprise and speed, is not hard to imagine. The famous specimen of Velociraptor mongoliensis locked in combat with a Protoceratops, the so-called fighting dinosaurs discovered by a Polish-Mongolian expedition in 1971, is often read as a story about predation, about the drama of a theropod attacking its prey. But it can also be read, given what we now understand about Protoceratops' social behavior, as a story about defense. The Protoceratops in that specimen did not simply submit to the attack. It clamped its beak around the Velociraptor's right arm and held it there while the Velociraptor drove its killing claw into the Protoceratops's throat. Both animals died together, preserved in the mutual grip of a struggle that neither won. Whatever the Protoceratops was defending, whether its own life, a nest, a group of young, or all of these things at once, it was not passive. It fought. This matters for parenting because the capacity and willingness to defend young against predators is a fundamental aspect of active parental care. and it requires a level of investment in offspring survival that goes well beyond egg laying. An animal that fights to the death in defense of a nest or a family group is an animal that has, in the language of evolutionary biology, a very high valuation of its offspring's survival relative to its own. This valuation has costs, obvious and severe, but it has benefits that must, in the right ecological conditions, outweigh those costs. The fact that we see it again and again across different dinosaur lineages, in hadrosaurs and ceratopsians and oviraptorids and possibly others, suggests that those conditions were widespread in the Mesozoic world. The ecological context in which dinosaur nesting happened is worth examining carefully, because the threats faced by nesting dinosaurs shaped the parenting behaviors that evolved to meet them. The late Cretaceous ecosystems of Western North America and Central Asia, the two regions from which most of our detailed nesting evidence comes, were not peaceful places. They were dynamic, productive, and full of predators at multiple scales. In the Hell Creek Formation of Montana and the Dakotas, the formation that records the last few million years before the end Cretaceous mass extinction, the predator community was dominated at the top by Tyrannosaurus rex, an animal so large and so well equipped for killing that it has become the icon of predatory power in all of popular culture. But T-Rex was not the only threat to a nesting hadrosaur. Smaller tyrannosaurids, dromaeosaurids with their famous sickle claws, and troodontids with their relatively large brains and probable pack-hunting behavior, all prowled the same floodplains and forests. Egg stealers and nest raiders at the small end of the scale could have been devastating to unguarded clutches. A single dromaeosaurid moving through a nesting ground at night could have destroyed multiple clutches in an hour if the nests were unattended. This predator pressure is part of the selection pressure that favored staying. A Maiasaura sitting near its nest at night was an enormous, vocal, and potentially dangerous animal to approach. 7 metric tons of hadrosaur, alert and defensive, is a very different obstacle from an empty nest in the dark. The choice to stay, or more precisely the evolutionary selection for the instinct and the physiology and the behavior that produces staying, was in part a response to the ecological reality that unguarded nests were destroyed. Nests. There is also the matter of temperature regulation for the eggs themselves. The late Cretaceous of Western North America was warmer than today on average, but it was not uniform or stable. Seasonal temperature swings, sudden cold snaps, and the variable shading of different nest sites meant that egg temperature could fluctuate significantly if no one was managing it. A brooding parent is a thermostat. An attentive parent that shifts its position, opens or covers the nest, or simply places its body between the clutch and an unseasonable cold front is keeping the embryos inside at the temperatures their development requires. This function, sometimes called thermal buffering, is one of the underappreciated aspects of parental care in animals that do not achieve it through full endothermy alone. Even if Maiasaura was warm-blooded enough to provide some direct warming to its eggs, the behavioral component, the management of nest exposure and shade and parental presence, mattered for the embryo's survival. The embryos themselves were not passive passengers in this process. There is increasing evidence, drawn from studies of modern bird embryos and applied by analogy to fossil evidence, that dinosaur embryos were acoustically active late in their development, capable of producing vocalizations from inside the egg that could communicate their developmental state to attending parents. Modern bird embryos of many species call from inside the egg in the last days before hatching, and the parents respond to these calls by adjusting their behavior, increasing attentiveness, modifying nest temperature management, or preparing to assist with hatching. If dinosaur embryos communicated in this way, then the relationship between parent and offspring began before hatching. An acoustic conversation through the shell, a preparation for the world outside that was already, in some sense, social. We cannot hear those calls. They are gone, absorbed into 66 million years of silence. but the behavior that produced them is preserved in the fossil record in the form of nests where hatching appears to have happened in sequence, with different eggs opening at different times, and in the form of nests where hatchlings remained associated with adults long after the first hatching event. These patterns are consistent with a managed, attended hatching process, not a simultaneous all-at-once emergence from a buried clutch, but a staggered, watched, responded to sequence of new arrivals in a nest that an adult was already maintaining. The living descendants of dinosaurs, the birds, are the richest source of comparison for understanding what non-avian dinosaur parenting might have looked like in its behavioral detail. This is not simply an analogy of convenience. Birds are dinosaurs. They are not animals that resemble dinosaurs or that evolved from a common ancestor with dinosaurs. They are, in the most technically precise sense, a lineage within the dinosaurs, specifically within the theropod dinosaurs, specifically within the Maniraptoran theropods, the group that also includes oviraptorids and dromaeosaurids and troodontids. The family tree of life does not place birds beside dinosaurs. It places them inside dinosaurs, as a surviving twig on a branch that was otherwise destroyed 66 million years ago. This means that when we look at how birds raise their young, we are looking at dinosaur parenting behavior that has survived into the present. It has been modified by 66 million years of evolution specific to the avian lineage, and many of its features have been gained or lost or transformed beyond recognition. But its deep structure, the basic architecture of how birds relate to their eggs and their young, is built on a foundation that was laid in the Mesozoic by animals that were not yet birds, but that were already well along the path toward the behavioral complexity that modern birds display. The diversity of modern avian parenting is staggering. At one extreme are the megapodes, a family of Australasian birds that build enormous mound nests of soil and decomposing vegetation, use the heat of fermentation and solar radiation to incubate their eggs without any direct bodily contact, and hatch young that are among the most precocial of any bird species, capable of flight within hours of emergence. Megapode parenting, in terms of direct investment in hatched young, is essentially zero. The work is all in the mound, all in the engineering of an incubation chamber whose temperature the attending male manages by adding or removing material from the surface. A form of thermostat management that can last for months. But the young, once they fight their way out of the mound, are on their own. At the other extreme are species like albatrosses, where a single egg is incubated by both parents in shifts for 65 to 82 days, the longest incubation period of any bird, and where the chick, once hatched, is attended and fed for an additional 9 months before it fledges. Wandering albatross pairs raise a single chick every 2 years, not because they cannot produce eggs more frequently, but because the investment required to successfully fledge one chick is so enormous that attempting to raise a young in consecutive years would compromise the parent's survival and long-term reproductive output. The albatross represents the maximum end of avian parental investment, a system in which the quality of each offspring is prioritized so highly over quantity that the number of young produced per year approaches 1. Most birds fall somewhere between these extremes. The majority of songbirds, for example, incubate for 2 weeks, feed nestlings for another 2 weeks in the nest, and continue to feed and supervise fledglings for several additional weeks after they leave the nest. The total investment per breeding attempt is measured in months rather than days, and most songbirds attempt multiple broods per season. The complexity of care in these species, the recognition of individual young by voice and appearance, the division of labor between parents, the teaching of foraging techniques to fledglings, the management of nest hygiene to reduce parasite load. All of this is a behavioral system of considerable sophistication. The earliest birds, those that lived alongside non-avian dinosaurs in the Mesozoic, were not albatrosses. They were not songbirds. They were small-brained, small-bodied, toothed flying animals whose behavioural repertoire was probably considerably simpler than that of modern birds, though certainly not absent. The Mesozoic fossil record of birds, dominated by the Enantiornithenans, a now extinct group of toothed birds that were the most diverse avian group in the Cretaceous, shows animals whose anatomy suggests a mix of precocial and altricial features. They had relatively larger brains than non-avian dinosaurs of comparable body size, but smaller brains relative to body size than most modern birds. Their limb bones ossify rapidly, suggesting a trajectory closer to precocial development, where young can move independently soon after hatching, than to the altricial development of songbirds, whose nestlings are naked and helpless and entirely dependent on parental feeding. An enantiornithine chick probably hatched in a state that was reasonably capable, able to perch, to move, perhaps to follow adults, though certainly in need of warmth and protection, and likely some provisioning of food. Its parents, in turn, were probably attending and responsive, brooding the chick for warmth at night, perhaps calling it to food sources, perhaps defending it against the small predators that prowled the forests and shrubs of the Cretaceous. These are inferences from anatomy and from the phylogenetic bracket, the range of behaviours seen in the living relatives that bookend the extinct group. But they are reasonable inferences consistent with everything the evidence suggests about the trajectory of parental care in the theropod lineage. Recognition between parent and offspring is one of the most fundamental requirements of selective parental care. An animal that feeds its young must, at some level, know which young are its own. This sounds simple, but it is actually a significant cognitive and perceptual problem. In a colonial nesting ground with dozens or hundreds of similar-looking young animals all vocalizing at once, identifying and preferentially caring for your own offspring requires a capacity for individual discrimination that is not trivial. Modern colonial birds solve this problem primarily through vocal recognition. Emperor penguins, which breed in colonies of tens of thousands, can recognize the call of their individual mate and chick amid the cacophony of thousands of simultaneously calling birds. The recognition is learned during the brooding period, imprinted through repeated exposure to the specific acoustic signature of their partner and offspring. Herring gulls recognize their own chicks by sight and sound within a few days of hatching. In some colonial species, nestmate recognition is so precise that a chick placed even a meter from its own nest will be attacked as a stranger if it blunders into a neighbor's territory. Whether colonial nesting dinosaurs had comparable recognition systems is not something the fossil record can tell us directly, but the ecology strongly implies it. A Maiasaura nesting ground with multiple adults and dozens of young of varying ages is a situation in which the ability to distinguish your own offspring from your neighbor's offspring and to direct your provisioning effort accordingly would have a clear selective advantage. An adult that brought food to any young animal within range would rapidly be exploited by the young of less attentive neighbors, depleting its resources without advancing its own reproductive success. Selection for individual recognition in this context would be strong and rapid, and the result would be a parent-offspring relationship structured around specific recognition cues, whether acoustic, visual, olfactory, or some combination. The display behaviors of theropod dinosaurs are relevant here, though they are a topic that the fossil record preserves only in fragments. Crests, frills, plates, and elaborate bony structures of many kinds are found in dinosaurs across multiple lineages, and some of these are best understood as display structures involved in mate choice, territorial signaling, or species recognition. The elaborate cranial crests of hadrosaurs, for example, including the hollow resonating chambers of lambeosaurines like Corythosaurus and Parasaurolophus, were almost certainly used to produce sounds. The internal anatomy of these crests, as reconstructed from CT scanning of fossil skulls, shows chambers and passages that would have functioned as resonators, amplifying and modulating vocalizations in species-specific ways. A Parasaurolophus, calling from the edge of a forest, would have produced a sound unlike any other animal in its ecosystem, a deep, resonant, tubular tone that carried through vegetation and would have been recognizable to conspecifics at considerable distance. If adult hadrosaurs use their crests for long-distance communication with each other, it is at least plausible that the same or related vocalizations served in the context of parent-offspring communication within the nesting ground, as a means of adults calling young to them or of young identifying the approach of their specific parent amid the noise of a colony. The acoustics of hadrosaur crests have been modeled in some detail by researchers including David Weisample of Johns Hopkins University, and while the precise frequencies and tones produced by extinct animals can only be approximated, the models are consistent with a rich and varied vocal repertoire. Hadrosaurs may have been among the loudest and most vocally complex of all dinosaurs, and if so, that vocal complexity almost certainly extended into their social and reproductive behavior. There is also the matter of color. We have touched on egg pigmentation and what it implies about nesting in the open, but the coloration of the animals themselves, the adults and the young, carried its own information in a social context. We cannot see dinosaur colors the way we see living animals, because soft tissue does not ordinarily fossilize and because the pigment cells that produce coloration decay rapidly after death. But in the last 15 years, a technique called melanosomy analysis has opened a small window into dinosaur color for some species. Melanosomes are the subcellular organelles that produce melanin pigments, and in specimens with exceptionally well-preserved feather or scale impressions, the shape and arrangement of melanosomes can be compared to the shapes and arrangements found in modern birds with known coloration. The small feathered dinosaur Microraptor gui from the Yixian Formation of China was determined through melanosome analysis to have been iridescent black, similar in its optical properties to the plumage of a modern crow. Sinosauropteryx, a small non-avian theropod from the same formation, appears to have had an orange and white striped tail. Anchiornis huxley, a small four-winged dinosaur related to the ancestry of birds, had black and white patterned wings with a rusty red crown. These are individual data points from a tiny sample of the full diversity of Mesozoic dinosaurs, but they are enough to establish that the visual world of dinosaurs was not monochrome or dull. These were animals that could see in color, that produced color, and that presumably read color as social information the way modern birds do. If adult theropods were colorful and visually complex animals, their young were almost certainly visually different from adults, as they are in most modern bird species. The difference in appearance between a juvenile and an adult is not accidental. It is a signal. In many bird species, juvenile plumage serves as a social signal that suppresses aggression from adults, advertising a non-competitive status that allows young birds to be tolerated in territories and flocking situations where adults might otherwise attack them. In colonial nesters, distinctive juvenile coloration or patterning can help adults identify young animals that need provisioning versus adults that do not. The visual differentiation between age classes is part of the social communication system of the species, and it is almost certainly more ancient than birds themselves. A Maiasaura hatchling lying in a nest bowl in the Montana summer, looking up at the enormous shape of its parent moving toward it with its low hadrosaur rumble and its smell of mud and vegetation, was already, at the moment of hatching, embedded in a social system with rules and signals and recognition cues. It was not dropped into a world where every interaction was random. It was born into a relationship, built by biology and behavior over millions of years of evolutionary selection, that placed it within the care of something larger that had already been waiting for it. That is a remarkable thing. It is a familiar thing, and it is very, very old. The question of how long dinosaur young stayed with their parents, and what the structure of juvenile dinosaur social life looked like during that time, is one that recent paleontology has begun to address through the study of juvenile specimens in the context of adult specimens from the same sites. The pattern that emerges is more varied than a simple story of nest-bound dependency, followed by sudden independence. In the 2012 study of a bone bed in the Two Medicine Formation of Montana, paleontologist Brandon Zano and colleagues described an association of juvenile Maiasaura individuals of multiple size classes, from very young to subadult, found together without accompanying adult specimens. This kind of juvenile aggregation, called a nursery group in the popular literature, suggests that as Maiasaura, young grew large enough to leave the immediate vicinity of the nest, they did not scatter as individuals into the broader landscape. They moved together in cohorts of age-matched or size-matched companions, traveling. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Traveling and presumably foraging as a group. The adults may have accompanied and monitored these groups, or may have allowed them increasing independence as they grew, much as elephant mothers accompany their young calves closely, but gradually allow older offspring more freedom within the family group. The Two Medicine Formation has been particularly productive for understanding Maiasaura social development, because it contains multiple bone beds, concentrations of fossil bones that formed when groups of animals died together, probably in catastrophic events like floods or droughts or fires. Bone beds that contain only juveniles, only subadults, or only adults of a single species tell you something about the social organization of that species during life. Animals that die together in floods live together. The sorting of Maiasaura by age class in different bone beds suggests a social structure in which age-based cohorts were a persistent feature of the animals' lives, not just a feature of the nesting season. This has parallels in the social organization of many modern herd animals, from wildebeest to bison to elephants, where juveniles of similar age spend significant time in each other's company, developing the social relationships and learned behaviors that will shape their adult lives. For Maiasaura, the nesting ground was perhaps the initial social matrix, the place where the first associations were formed, the place where the rules of the species' social world were first encountered and learned, and the juvenile cohorts that formed in and around the nest persisted as those animals grew, creating social bonds that may have been maintained for years. The Ornithischian dinosaurs, the large group that includes hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs, stegosaurs, pachycephalosaurs, and the various iguanodontian lineages, show a wide range of evidence for social complexity. Ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, are found in extraordinary bone beds across the American West and Canada. Bone beds that sometimes contain hundreds or thousands of individuals of the same species. Evidence of mass mortality events that struck entire herds. A herd of Styracosaurus or Centrosaurus or Triceratops that drowned crossing a flooding river or was trapped by a rapidly advancing wildfire leaves behind an accumulation of bones that can preserve the demographic structure of the living group. Studies of these bone beds consistently show the presence of young animals, including very young animals, alongside adults, suggesting that herds were multi-generational, that young stayed with the herd, that adults in the herd provided a social environment that included the young as full members. Whether the direct parental relationship persisted within these herds, whether specific adults recognized and specifically attended to their own young, is harder to establish. But the ecological logic is consistent with it. A young ceratopsian of the size that could survive in the open was still vulnerable to tyrannosaur predation, still dependent on the collective vigilance of the herd, still best served by proximity to adults who could interpose themselves between a young animal and an approaching predator. The herd itself was a form of extended parental care, a social structure that buffered juveniles against the threats that individual animals could not withstand alone. The ankylosaurs, those remarkable armored dinosaurs covered in bony plates and studs, and, in some species, equipped with a tail club of bone heavy enough to shatter the leg of a tyrannosaur, are less well represented in terms of nesting evidence than hadrosaurs or ceratopsians. Their eggs have not been definitively identified, and their nest sites are unknown. But their anatomy tells a story about early life that is worth attending to. Young ankylosaurs, based on the few juvenile specimens known, were already armored, already equipped with the bony dermal plates called osteoderms that covered their backs in adulthood. These were not soft, vulnerable hatchlings that needed a great deal of external protection to survive. Their armor was a primary defense, and it was operational from the beginning. This suggests a somewhat different developmental trajectory from the Maiasaura model. A hatchling ankylosaur whose armor is already forming and functional is a hatchling that has relatively more capacity for independent survival than a soft-boned hadrosaur hatchling. If ankylosaur young were more precocial at hatching, more capable of moving and self-defending from the start, then the period of intense parental dependency may have been shorter, and the investment required per offspring may have been proportionally lower. This does not mean ankylosaur parents were absent. It means the nature and duration of their care may have differed from the intensive nest-bound feeding seen in Maiasaura. The stegosaurs, the plated dinosaurs that preceded ankylosaurs as the dominant armored herbivores of the Jurassic, are even more poorly known in terms of reproductive behavior. Stegosaurus eggs have not been confidently identified. Juvenile specimens exist but are rare. What can be said is that the plates and spines of stegosaurs, whose function has been debated for over a century, were almost certainly involved in social signaling of some kind, whether thermoregulation, species recognition, mate choice, or a combination. Social display structures of this sophistication imply social complexity, and social complexity in the context of a species biology almost always implies some form of extended social relationship, including between adults and young. Among the giant long-necked sauropods, the developmental picture is one of the most dramatic in all of paleontology, precisely because the scale of growth from hatchling to adult is so extreme. A titanosaur hatchling, based on the Aucamahuevo embryos and comparable evidence from other sites, hatched at roughly 30 to 40 centimeters in length and perhaps a few hundred grams in weight. An adult titanosaur of the same species might have been 30 meters long and weighed 40 to 70 metric tons. This is a growth ratio of something like 10,000 to 1 in terms of mass, accomplished over a lifespan that was probably 60 to 80 years, or possibly longer. The scaling problem this creates for parental care is immediately obvious. An adult titanosaur cannot attend to its own young without risk of trampling them. An animal whose footprint is a meter across, whose every movement is attended by a ground vibration felt at considerable distance, is simply too large to be closely associated with a hatchling that can be killed by a misplaced step. This is probably one of the reasons why sauropod eggs appear to have been buried and left, why the investment was in the egg quality and nest site selection, rather than in post-hatching attendance. The parent was, in a literal physical sense, too big to stay. But this does not mean sauropod young grew up entirely alone. The question of whether juvenile sauropods associated with adults has been addressed through the study of trackways, fossilized footprints preserved in ancient muds and sediments that show the movements of groups of sauropods. Some trackway sites show a pattern in which small sauropod tracks appear in the center of a group of adult tracks, surrounded by the larger footprints on the outside. This arrangement has been interpreted as evidence of protective herding behavior, with adults surrounding and shielding young from predators in the way that modern elephants form a circle around their calves when threatened. The interpretation is contested because trackways can form in complex ways, and the arrangement of tracks can reflect substrate conditions and movement patterns that have nothing to do with group protection. But the possibility remains, supported by ecological logic if not by definitive evidence. There is one more piece of evidence for sauropod social structure around young animals that comes from a quite different direction. In 2023, a study of bone surface texture and bone histology from associated juvenile sauropod specimens in China described a collection of young individuals, all of roughly the same developmental stage, found together at a single site in Yunnan province. The animals were not hatchlings. They were older juveniles, perhaps 1 to 2 years old, at a stage of development when they were already several meters long but nowhere near adult size. Their association at a single site, in the same rock horizon, suggests a social grouping of same-age individuals, a juvenile cohort of the kind seen in Maiasaura. Whether adults were part of this grouping at the time of death is unclear from the preserved material, but the juveniles were not scattered. They were together. For the theropods, the evidence of juvenile social behavior is somewhat different, and it points in directions that can still generate considerable scientific debate. The bone beds of Deinonychus, the large dromaeosaurid that inspired the velociraptors of film and popular culture, are sometimes cited as evidence of pack hunting, of coordinated group predation by multiple individuals. This interpretation is not universally accepted, because the accumulation of multiple Deinonychus specimens around a single large prey animal, the ornithopod Tenontosaurus, could reflect competitive feeding rather than cooperative hunting. But whether or not Deinonychus hunted in organized packs, the presence of multiple individuals at the same site suggests social tolerance of some kind, and social tolerance is the precondition for any form of extended social relationship between individuals. The nesting behavior of dromaeosaurids is poorly known directly, but the phylogenetic bracket, the behaviors seen in their closest relatives among both non-avian dinosaurs and modern birds, suggests that active nest attendance was likely. Their small size, high metabolic rate, and the evidence for sophisticated sensory systems, including large eyes, and well-developed olfactory and auditory processing regions visible in their brain case morphology, all point toward animals that were cognitively capable of the kind of individual recognition and targeted behavioral response that attended parental care requires. Whether a Deinonychus parent brought food to its young, or whether its young were capable enough at hatching to join the parent in foraging, or some combination of the two, is a question that remains open in the literature. Tyrannosaurus rex, the apex predator of the Hell Creek Formation, whose parenting behavior has been the subject of occasional popular speculation but limited serious study, is represented by enough juvenile specimens to establish some aspects of its developmental trajectory. Rex juveniles, in the size range of about 2 to 4 meters, appear to have had a body form and locomotor capacity that was significantly different from adults. They were more lightly built, with longer, more slender limbs relative to their body size, and they may have occupied a somewhat different ecological niche from adults, hunting smaller prey more quickly rather than the large, slow-moving herbivores that a 7-ton adult could tackle. This ecological separation between juvenile and adult T-Rex, if real, would have reduced competition for resources between the two age classes, which in some modern predator species facilitates longer association between parents and offspring without the resource conflict that would otherwise drive separation. Whether T-Rex attended nests, brooded eggs, or provisioned young in the way that small theropods did is unknown. The scaling problem that affected sauropods operated here as well. A 7-ton adult T-Rex sitting on eggs would have been as destructive as a bulldozer. Nest attendance, if it occurred in tyrannosaurs, was probably not physical brooding. It may have been a form of guarding, remaining near a buried or concealed nest site to deter predators, the way that some large modern birds guard nest sites without direct physical contact with the eggs. This is speculation, and honest paleontology acknowledges it as such, but the speculation is grounded in the same ecological logic that applies to every parenting system we have discussed. If the benefit to offspring survival exceeds the cost to parental survival and future reproduction, the behavior evolves. There is a question that sits at the center of all this, and it is one that the science has been slowly building toward for decades, without quite arriving. The question is this: did the capacity for parental care help dinosaurs survive the catastrophe at the end of the Cretaceous? And the corollary: did the presence of parental care in the ancestors of birds help birds survive when almost everything else did not? 66 million years ago, on a day that was otherwise unremarkable in the Cretaceous world, a rock approximately 12 kilometers in diameter struck the shallow sea that covered what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico at a speed of roughly 20 kilometers per second. The impact was so energetic that it is almost impossible to describe adequately. The explosion released roughly 10 billion times more energy than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The asteroid vaporized on impact, along with a vast column of rock and seawater and evaporated sulfur from the Yucatan's thick layers of sulfate-rich limestone. A global layer of soot, sulfuric acid aerosols, and pulverized rock entered the atmosphere within hours. The sky darkened, photosynthesis collapsed, temperatures dropped sharply. The food chains that had supported 200 million years of dinosaur dominance unraveled from the bottom up. In this catastrophe, approximately 75% of all species on Earth went extinct. The non-avian dinosaurs, all of them, every last lineage, were gone within a few thousand years of the impact. Perhaps within a few hundred years in the worst affected regions. The great sauropods, the hadrosaurs, the ceratopsians, the tyrannosaurs, the ankylosaurs, the stegosaurs, the long lineages of armored and crested and spined and horned giants that had filled every large animal ecological niche on every continent for so long, all of them vanished. The bone beds went cold, the nesting grounds went silent. But the birds survived. Not all birds. Many Cretaceous bird lineages, including all of the enantiornithines, the most diverse avian group of the Cretaceous, also went extinct. But a subset of the avian lineage, the neornithines, the ancestors of all living birds, made it through. They were small, they ate seeds and insects and probably whatever was available in the post-impact landscape of dead wood and opportunistic fungi and scattered survivors. They were already adapted to the kind of flexible, generalist living that a catastrophically disrupted ecology demands. And they reproduced. The question of whether their parenting behavior contributed to their survival is genuinely interesting and genuinely uncertain. It has been argued by the paleontologist David Verricchio, among others, that the precocial developmental strategy of at least some dinosaur lineages may have been a liability in the post-impact world. Precocial young, those that hatch in a relatively advanced state and are quickly independent, require that the world they are born into is immediately habitable. They need food accessible at their level, temperature conditions they can tolerate, and an ecological community that offers the resources they require. In a world where the food chains have collapsed, precocial young face the same crisis that adults face, immediately and directly, with no buffer. Altricial young, those that hatch in a relatively helpless state and require parental provisioning, are partially insulated from immediate environmental crisis by their parents' ability to find and deliver food in forms the young cannot obtain themselves. If resources are scattered and hard to find, adults with mobility and experience can range widely and bring food home. The chick in the nest waits. It does not need to navigate a disrupted world. It needs only to receive what its parents deliver. In a world where food is scarce and dispersed, and the ecological rules have just been rewritten, having a parent who can find and deliver resources to you is, quite possibly, a survival advantage. This is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. The fossil record does not preserve the moment when a surviving bird parent returned to a nest in the post-impact darkness with a beakful of food that kept its chick alive while the world around them was in chaos. But the logic is consistent with the observation that the surviving birds were small, metabolically active, and reproductively flexible, capable of adjusting clutch size, incubation timing, and provisioning rates in response to environmental conditions. These are characteristics of animals whose parenting behavior was already sophisticated, already tuned to a complex and variable world. The other factor worth considering is the size advantage. In the aftermath of an impact winter that shut down photosynthesis for months or years, large animals faced a severe energetic crisis. A Maiasaura, feeding 7 or 8 young animals, while itself consuming enormous quantities of vegetation daily, was a biological system that could not function when the plant stopped growing. Large-bodied dinosaurs with large-bodied young requiring intensive provisioning were metabolic liabilities in a world where caloric input had fallen catastrophically. Small birds with small young that could be fed on seeds and insects, and the decaying flesh of animals that had already died were, by comparison, frugally efficient. The survivors, in other words, were not just the lucky ones. They were the ones whose biology and behavior were suited to the specific conditions of the catastrophe. And among the features of their biology that proved relevant was how they reproduced and how they raised their young. The nesting strategies, the parental care systems, the flexibility and energy efficiency of avian reproduction, these were not incidental. They were part of the survival kit. We should pause here and sit with the scale of what we are discussing. The lineage that survived included the ancestors of every bird alive today. Every hummingbird and penguin and eagle and sparrow and albatross and chicken and crow and toucan, every one of the roughly 10,000 living bird species descends from something small that nested in the post-impact world and raised its young through the catastrophe that ended the age of dinosaurs. The parenting behavior that we see in birds today is the product of 66 million years of refinement that began in that darkness. Every bird that has ever built a nest, incubated an egg, fed a gaping-mouthed chick, or defended its young from a predator is doing something that has been doing itself continuously, in an unbroken chain of generations, since before the first mammal was a rat-sized scuttler in the underbrush. There is something in this that is worth sitting with quietly, and we will sit with it in a moment. But first, let us consider one more dimension of dinosaur parenting that has received less attention in the popular literature than the nest-bound hadrosaurs and the brooding oviraptorids, and that is the question of learning. Because parental care is not only about physical survival, it is about the transmission of knowledge. Animals that learn from their parents have a significant advantage over animals that are born with all the information they will ever have. Innate behaviors are fixed by genetics and are, in a sense, the accumulated wisdom of all the ancestors who survived long enough to reproduce, encoded in the nervous system of each new individual. They are fast to deploy, reliable in the context for which they evolved, and available from birth. But they cannot be updated. They cannot incorporate new information about the specific landscape, the specific predators, the specific resource distribution of the place where an individual animal actually lives. For dinosaurs with parental care, this transfer of learned information was probably a real and significant component of the care relationship, even if its details are impossible to recover from the fossil record. A Maiasaura juvenile that spent its first year in the nesting ground with adults, and then moved with a juvenile cohort that was perhaps loosely accompanied by adults, was almost certainly acquiring behavioral information, learning the responses and routes and resource use patterns of the animals it was with. The floodplains of the Two Medicine Formation, with their seasonal floods, their predator territories, their shifting vegetation patterns, were complex and variable environments that rewarded experience. Experience in most social animals with long developmental periods is transmitted from older to younger individuals through the social bond. It is a form of culture in the broadest sense of the word, and it is almost as old as parental care itself. We know from modern studies of bird behavior that the transmission of learned information from parent to offspring is both real and ecologically significant. Song sparrows raised in isolation develop abnormal songs that are less effective in mate attraction and territorial defense than the songs of wild raised birds. Migratory routes in some bird species are culturally transmitted, with naive young birds following experienced adults to wintering grounds they would not find on their own. The specific foraging techniques of many bird species, including the use of tools in New Caledonian crows and the shell dropping of herring gulls, are learned from parents and social companions rather than innately specified. The behavioral inheritance that flows through avian families is as real and as evolutionarily significant as the genetic inheritance, and its roots are in the Mesozoic. Now, we should speak about what has been lost. Because for all the richness of what the fossil record preserves, it preserves almost nothing of the inner life of these animals. Nothing of. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Nothing of the texture of their individual experience. Nothing of what it was like to be a Maiasaura parent on a summer evening in the late Cretaceous, returning to a nest of warm, living young after an hour away on the floodplain. We can reconstruct the biology. We can reason about the behavior. But the experience, the weight of a parent's attention on the nest, the sound that a specific chick made when it heard its parent approaching, these things are gone so completely that it is almost metaphysically difficult to grasp. And yet they existed. They were real. For tens of millions of years, across hundreds of millions of individual lives, the relationship between a parent dinosaur and its young was as present and as specific and as physically real as any relationship in any living species today. The attention was real. The recognition was real. Whatever version of care and proximity and return-to-ness that these animals experienced, it was experienced moment by moment, generation after generation, in the specific landscapes of the Mesozoic world. The 66 million year gulf between us and those animals is real, and it is enormous, and it is largely unbridgeable in terms of direct knowledge, but across that gulf, if you look carefully, certain things remain continuous. The bird at your window this morning, the one that landed briefly and was gone, is doing something that connects you to all of this. It is a dinosaur. Its parents attended its egg with a warmth and a presence that had been, by the time that bird hatched, 66 million years in the making. It carries within its body the skeleton of something that walked beside hadrosaur nesting grounds, and watched oviraptorids brood in the Gobi sun, and heard the calls of animals that no human will ever hear. The thread is unbroken. It runs from the red badlands of Montana to the branch outside your window. Jack Horner, now retired from his long career at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, once described the moment of finding Egg Mountain as the moment when he understood that dinosaurs were not what everyone thought they were. Not cold, not absent, not alien to the kinds of relationships that we find meaningful and recognizable. They were, in this one crucial dimension at least, already something that we could read. Already engaged in the oldest and most fundamental of all biological projects, ensuring that the next generation would live. That is the part that gets me every time. Not the size of the animals, not the sweep of geological time, not even the extinction that ended their reign. It is the smallness of the act at the center of the story. An animal returning to a nest. Young animals making sounds that their parent had learned to recognize. The ordinary, ancient, repeated miracle of one generation caring for the next. It did not begin with us. It did not begin with mammals. It did not begin with the warm-blooded ancestors of warm-blooded creatures in the Triassic undergrowth. It was already present, already working, already shaping the lives of animals that lived in a world we can barely imagine, under skies we have never seen, in a time so remote that the continents were not yet in the positions they now occupy. Parental care is not a human invention. It is not even a mammalian invention. It is a feature of life on this planet that is at least as old as the dinosaurs, and perhaps older still. The fossil record is full of gaps, as it always is, and the gaps in what we know about dinosaur parenting are wide and humbling. We do not know whether hadrosaurs recognized individual young by voice or by smell, or by visual cues, or by some combination. We do not know how long the period of parental association lasted in most species. We do not know whether tyrannosaur parents stayed near their young, or whether ankylosaur nests were attended, or what the vocal repertoire of a nesting sauropod sounded like. We do not know how much of what we have described as parental behavior was conscious, in any sense that a philosopher or a neuroscientist would accept, and how much was the execution of deeply encoded instinct that produced the external form of care without any internal experience that we could recognize as caring. These are real gaps, and they matter, but they do not change the fundamental picture. The behavior was real. The nest at Egg Mountain was real. The brooding oviraptorid was real. The association of Protoceratops young with a Protoceratops adult in the rock of the Jadocta Formation is real, frozen in stone, a 75-million-year-old fact about how these animals lived. The evidence does not speak to interiority, but it speaks clearly about what the animals did. And what they did was stay. Let us return to the eggs for a moment, because there is still more in them than we have yet drawn out. The eggs of Hypacrosaurus stebingeri, a large Lambeosaurian hadrosaur from the Two Medicine Formation, have been studied in extraordinary detail by researchers including Darla Zelenitsky of the University of Calgary and her colleagues, and the embryos inside them have yielded information about dinosaur development that connects directly to the question of what kind of parent a Hypacrosaurus was. Hypacrosaurus embryos, examined in cross-section, show a pattern of neural development that is unusual and revealing. The brains of the embryos, preserved well enough to study in some specimens, show that at the time of hatching the cerebellum and other regions associated with motor coordination and learned behavior were still relatively undeveloped compared to adult proportions. This developmental profile is consistent with an altricial or semi-altricial strategy. The young animals needed time and experience after hatching to develop the neural architecture for complex, coordinated movement and behavior. It is another line of evidence for nest residency and parental attendance, because a young animal with an incompletely developed brain is an animal that is not ready to navigate the world independently. The embryos also allow a window into the rate of prenatal development, the time spent inside the egg before hatching. By comparing the developmental stage of the embryos to growth curves derived from hatched individuals of known age, researchers have estimated that Hypacrosaurus eggs had an incubation period of roughly 5 to 6 months, far longer than the incubation period of any modern bird of comparable body size, and comparable instead to the incubation period seen in modern crocodilians. This is significant because long incubation periods in modern animals are generally associated with slower metabolic rates during embryonic development, which in turn suggests that the embryo was not being kept at the high, stable temperatures that full endothermy would imply. The embryo was developing at a rate consistent with a somewhat lower metabolic environment than a bird's nest provides. This does not mean Hypacrosaurus was cold-blooded. The adult bone histology is clearly consistent with an elevated metabolic rate and rapid growth after hatching. It means that the incubation environment for the egg, whether warmth was provided primarily by the parent's body or by ambient heat from the substrate and environment, did not maintain the very high temperatures that shorten incubation time in modern birds. This is consistent with a brooding posture that did not involve direct full body contact with the eggs, perhaps a guarding and thermoregulating posture rather than a full bird-style sit. The picture that emerges is of an animal that was behaviorally committed to its nest, but whose physiology during the egg stage was operating at somewhat different parameters from its postnatal physiology. The transition from egg to hatchling was a transition into a faster metabolizing, faster growing, more thermodynamically active mode of existence. The year 2004 brought another remarkable piece of evidence for dinosaur parental behavior from a direction no one had expected. A team led by Paul Sereno of the University of Chicago excavating in the Sahara Desert of Niger at a site in the formation called the Echkar Member, found the remains of a small sauropod nesting ground. The site contained multiple eggs and hatchlings of a titanosaur species, along with what appeared to be a fragmentary adult individual nearby. The nesting density and the arrangement of the eggs suggested deliberate site selection and perhaps repeated use of the location across multiple breeding seasons. What made this site particularly interesting was the geological context. The Echkar Member represents an environment that was seasonally arid in the late Cretaceous, a landscape of rivers and flood basins that dried dramatically between wet seasons. Nesting in such an environment required careful site selection to ensure that the eggs would not be inundated by flooding, but also that they would receive enough moisture to prevent desiccation. The choice of nesting site in this context implies an assessment of local conditions that goes beyond simple behavior. It implies a form of environmental judgment, however encoded in instinct, that is responsive to the specific features of a particular place. The animals were not nesting randomly, they were choosing. Environmental selection of nest sites has been documented in multiple dinosaur nesting grounds, including Egg Mountain itself, where the nests appear to have been placed on elevated ground above the floodplain, in positions that reduce the risk of inundation from the rivers that seasonally rose across the two Medicine Formation's lowlands. This kind of site preference, consistent across individuals and across generations at the same location, implies that the knowledge of which sites were suitable was either innately encoded or learned and transmitted, perhaps through the same kind of cultural inheritance that operates in modern colonial nesters, where young birds observe and learn nest site preferences from experienced adults in the colony. The Psittacosaurus lugiatunensis, specimens from the early Cretaceous of northeastern China, provide another extraordinary window into dinosaur family life, one that comes from a completely different part of the dinosaur family tree. Psittacosaurus was a small ceratopsian, a parrot-beaked dinosaur about 1.5 meters long in adulthood, and it is one of the best-known dinosaurs in terms of specimens, with hundreds of individuals of different ages found at various sites across Asia. In 2004, a specimen was described that contained the remains of a single adult Psittacosaurus with 34 juveniles of very similar size, clustered around and beneath it. The sheer number of juveniles, 34, is almost certainly more than a single female could have produced in one breeding season. Psittacosaurus females, based on comparison with the egg sizes known from the genus and with the hatching size of juveniles, probably laid clutches of between 15 and 30 eggs at most. 34 same-sized juveniles under a single adult therefore implies either an unusually large clutch or, more likely, the combining of multiple clutches under the care of a single adult. This is a behavior known in modern birds, called nest aggregation or cooperative brooding in some contexts, and it is most commonly associated with male caregivers in species where males tend nests and accept eggs from multiple females. A male Psittacosaurus attending a combined clutch of young from several females is consistent with everything Verricchio's analysis of theropod clutch volumes suggested for the broader theropod lineage, and it extends that picture into the ceratopsian lineage, suggesting that male-dominated care, or at least care not exclusively tied to the biological mother, may have been widespread in dinosaurs. The juveniles in the Psittacosaurus specimen are crowded together in a way that suggests they were alive when they died, not scattered or stacked by post-death water transport, but grouped in the way living animals group when they are seeking warmth or shelter. The adult appears to have died in place above them, perhaps having been buried alive in a volcanic surge from the nearby eruptions that so frequently produce the exceptional preservation seen in Yixian equivalent sediments. The scene preserved in that rock is one of terrible intimacy, an adult and its charges, together in their last moment, in a posture that speaks of shelter, given and received. The Yixian formation of Liaoning province in China, and the related formations of the same region, have produced more significant dinosaur specimens bearing on parenting and social behavior than perhaps any comparable area in the world. The extraordinary preservation conditions of these deposits, the result of frequent volcanic ashfall events that buried animals rapidly and in fine-grained sediment that preserved soft tissue as well as bone, have given paleontologists access to aspects of dinosaur biology that would be invisible in ordinary fossil preservation. Feather color, skin texture, stomach contents, posture at death, and social groupings at the moment of burial are all visible in Yixian material in ways that are simply not available from most other Mesozoic deposits. Among the most remarkable of the Yixian specimens bearing on parenting are the multiple examples of small feathered theropods found in what appear to be brooding or protective postures. A specimen of Mei Long, a small troodontid, was found curled in a sleeping posture with its head tucked beneath a forelimb, in a position that is nearly identical to the sleeping posture of modern birds. This is not direct evidence of parenting, but it is evidence that these animals rested and sheltered in the same postural mode as modern birds, which carries implications for how they interacted with eggs and young. An animal that sleeps in a bird posture, that uses its feathered forelimbs as insulation during rest, is an animal whose body plan is already organized around the same thermoregulatory and postural principles that produce avian brooding. A specimen of Sinornithosaurus, a small dromaeosaurid from the Yixian, was found with prey remains in its stomach cavity, and the analysis of those remains showed teeth and bones of small animals, confirming that it was an active predator in life, and that its digestive biology was functioning at the time of its sudden burial. Separately, a juvenile Sinornithosaurus specimen shows bone histology consistent with the rapid fibrolamellar bone growth of a warm-blooded animal investing heavily in early development. These two lines of evidence together, an active adult predator and a rapidly growing juvenile, are consistent with a species in which adults provisioned young during the period of rapid growth, when the juvenile's own foraging capacity was not yet sufficient to fuel the metabolic demands of their growth. The total picture that the Chinese feathered dinosaur record provides is one of a group of small, active, visually complex, behaviorally sophisticated animals whose biology was already deeply avian in its essentials decades or millions of years before any of them became capable of powered flight. The feathers, the postures, the bone histology, the egg colors, the brooding stances, all of these features of avian life were present in the non-avian dinosaurs of the Coelurosaur lineage, assembled gradually over tens of millions of years of evolution. Each feature added to a system that was already more capable, more energetically active, more behaviorally flexible than the old cold-blooded reptile model had ever suggested. Flight, when it finally appeared, was not a revolution. It was an addition. The birds that survived the end Cretaceous extinction were already attending their nests. They were already feeding their young. They were already brooding in the dark and calling to their chicks and making the thousand small decisions, in whatever register of animal cognition those decisions occupied, that constitute the act of raising young. Flight gave them a new dimension of mobility and a new set of ecological possibilities. It did not give them parenthood. Parenthood was already there, already ancient, already working. And here is the thing that makes this story resonate beyond paleontology, beyond the specific details of eggshells and bone histology and clutch volumes and nesting sites. The story of dinosaur parenting is a story about continuity in a world defined by catastrophe and change. The Mesozoic was not a stable world. It was a world of continental drift and volcanic episodes and sea level changes and mass extinctions and the constant churn of ecological replacement and speciation and extinction at every scale. Through all of it, certain behaviors persisted. Certain relationships were maintained. The relationship between parent and young, once it had been established in a lineage, proved remarkably resistant to the forces that destroyed everything else. The non-avian dinosaurs are gone, Their nesting grounds are silent. The floodplains of the Two Medicine Formation are now badlands and ranchland in Montana. The rock layers that held Maiasaura eggs now exposed by erosion and dotted by the careful excavations of paleontologists with brushes and dental picks. The Gobi Desert, where oviraptorids died on their nests in the middle of storms, is a cold and desolate place today, and the fossils that come out of its red rock do so in the hands of researchers who can barely imagine the world that produced them. The Yixian Formation, where small feathered dinosaurs were buried in volcanic ash before the Cretaceous was half over, is now agricultural land and mine workings, and the origin of some of the most important fossils ever discovered. But the behavior is not gone. It is alive. It is in every nest built this spring, in every egg incubated by a warm-blooded body, in every chick fed by a parent returning to the same location it has been returning to for weeks. The 66 million years that separate us from the last non-avian dinosaur are a long time by any ordinary measure. But they are not long enough to break the thread. There are roughly 10,000 species of living birds, and virtually all of them attend their eggs and care for their young in some form. The range of those forms is, as we have seen, enormous, from the minimal nest management of the megapode to the years-long parental investment of the albatross. But the structure is the same in all of them: an adult committed to the success of the young it produced, an adult returning, an adult that stayed. That is the oldest story in the world. Older than our species, older than our genus, older than the mammalian lineage from which we came. It begins somewhere in the deep Mesozoic, in a moment that the fossil record can hint at but cannot capture, when the first dinosaur parent made the choice, or followed the instinct, or expressed the genetically encoded behavior that caused it to remain near the life it had made. And from that first staying, or that first return, every nest ever built, every egg ever warmed, every young animal ever fed by a parent who had gone away and come back, descends in a direct and unbroken line. We are late arrivals in this story. Our species is 200,000 years old in the most generous reconstruction, and the behaviors we practice in raising our young, however culturally elaborated and cognitively complex, are built on a biological substrate that was old when the first human was born. The instinct to protect, the recognition of the young individual as something that matters, the return to where the small and vulnerable are waiting. These are not human inventions. They are dinosaur legacies carried forward through 66 million years of avian evolution, and then through some deep mammalian homology in the structure of care, through our own lineage as well. We share not only the behavior, but the evolutionary logic that produced it. Offspring are worth the investment, because the world is dangerous, and the ones who stayed were the ones whose young survived. It is worth pausing in the science for a moment, and thinking about how any of this knowledge came to exist. Because the story of dinosaur parenting is also a story about the people who found the evidence, and the conditions under which they found it, and the choices they made in interpreting what they saw. Science is not a machine that automatically converts observations into conclusions. It is a human practice, shaped by the assumptions and the tools and the cultural context of the people who practice it. The reason dinosaur parenting was invisible for 100 years was not simply that the evidence was absent. Some of the evidence was there in the rock, waiting. The reason it was invisible was that the people looking were not looking for it, because their framework told them it could not be there. The rock shop in Bynum, Montana, where Marion Brandvold kept her coffee can of small bones, was not a scientific institution. It was a place where locals who found fossils while working the land or walking the hills brought things that seemed interesting and unusual, hoping to sell them or simply to have someone tell them what they were. The paleontological establishment, based in museums and universities far from the Montana Badlands, did not routinely pay attention to such places. Jack Horner, who had grown up in Shelby, Montana, who had spent years hunting fossils in the Badlands before he had a job that gave him institutional support to do so, was different. He was connected to the landscape in a way that most academic paleontologists were not. He understood, intuitively, that important material came from everywhere. Not just from sites discovered by museum expeditions, not just from published localities in the scientific literature. His visit to Branvold's rock shop and his recognition of what she had in that can was not luck in any simple sense. It was the convergence of preparation and openness and a particular kind of attention. The attention of someone who had spent years looking at these rocks and who therefore knew, when he saw those small bones, that they were something he had never seen before and that they were worth following wherever they led. What they led to was a complete revision of how the scientific community understood dinosaur behavior, and ultimately how the public understood dinosaurs in the most fundamental terms. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Horner spent years at Egg Mountain and its surrounding sites. Season after season through the late 1970s and the 1980s, he and his teams excavated with the slow, methodical patience that good paleontology requires. The careful removal of rock millimeter by millimeter, with picks and brushes and dental tools and compressed air. The recording of every bone's position before it is moved. The mapping of associations and orientations that will be meaningless after the rock is gone. The nesting ground gave up its secrets reluctantly and incrementally, as they always do, and each new season brought new specimens that added nuance to the picture. The first nest had suggested parental care. The second and third and 10th nests confirmed it. The bone histology told the story of growth rates. The worn teeth told the story of provisioning. The nest spacing told the story of colonial behavior. Each line of evidence was independent, and each line said the same thing. This convergence of independent evidence on a single conclusion is how science works when it is working well. It is not proof in the mathematical sense, because paleontology almost never achieves mathematical proof. It is the accumulation of consistent evidence from different directions until the alternative explanations become progressively less credible, and the simplest explanation, the one that accounts for all the data without requiring additional assumptions, becomes the working consensus. The parental care hypothesis for Maiasaura reached that status in the late 1980s, and subsequent decades of additional discovery have done nothing to undermine it. Modern paleontology has added methods to the toolkit that Horner and his contemporaries could not have imagined. Computed tomography, the same scanning technology used in medical imaging, can reveal the internal structure of fossils without destroying the specimen, allowing researchers to see the bone within the rock, the embryo within the egg, the stomach contents within the rib cage, without the physical exposure that would damage or destroy the delicate material. CT scanning has transformed the study of embryos in particular, allowing the detailed analysis of skull anatomy and brain endocasts in specimens where only a millimeter or two of rock separates the delicate eggshell from the air. Synchrotron radiation facilities, particle accelerators that produce extremely intense beams of X-rays, allow the imaging of specimens at resolutions approaching the cellular level, revealing details of bone histology and tissue microstructure that are invisible to conventional microscopy without destructive thin sectioning. The melanosome analysis that revealed the color of Microraptor and Sinosauropteryx required synchrotron imaging of fossil feather barbules at nanometer resolution. These are technologies built for materials science and physics research that have been adapted with considerable ingenuity to the needs of paleontology. Stable isotope analysis, the measurement of the relative proportions of different isotopes of elements like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and strontium preserved in fossil bone and tooth enamel, has opened new windows into questions of diet, migration, growth rate, and body temperature. The temperature of formation of a biological mineral, whether bone or tooth enamel or eggshell, affects the ratio of oxygen isotopes incorporated into the crystal structure of that mineral in a predictable way, and measuring those ratios in fossil material provides information about the thermal environment in which the tissue formed. For eggs, this means information about nest temperatures. For bones, it means information about body temperature. The data are not simple to interpret because biological tissues undergo chemical alteration over millions of years of burial. And separating the original biological signal from the diagenetic overprint is a significant analytical challenge. But the methods are improving rapidly, and the conclusions they support are increasingly well-grounded. The study of ancient DNA is not yet applicable to dinosaurs because DNA degrades completely over millions of years, and no credible claim of dinosaur DNA has ever withstood scientific scrutiny. The upper limit for ancient DNA preservation appears to be somewhere around 1 million years in the most favorable conditions, and dinosaurs are 66 million years old at the youngest. But ancient proteins, which are more stable than DNA, have been tentatively identified in some dinosaur bone specimens, including a famous study of Tyrannosaurus bone by Mary Schweitzer of North Carolina State University, who found what appeared to be soft tissue in a T-Rex femur, and later, more controversially, claimed to have identified collagen protein sequences from the bone. These claims remain contested, but the possibility that some molecular information survives in exceptionally preserved specimens is not dismissed by the field. If ancient proteins can eventually be reliably recovered and interpreted from dinosaur fossils, they would provide information about the biochemistry of these animals, including aspects of their reproductive and developmental biology that is currently entirely inaccessible. For now, we work with what we have. And what we have across the entire sweep of dinosaur paleontology as it currently stands is enough to build a picture of remarkable behavioral richness and diversity. The picture is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. The fossil record preserves a tiny fraction of the animals that ever lived, and an even smaller fraction of the behaviors those animals displayed. Most nests were never buried. Most parental interactions left no trace in rock. Most of what any dinosaur ever did is gone as completely as the thoughts of an animal that has been extinct for longer than our species has existed. But the nests that were buried, and the eggs that were preserved, and the embryos that fossilized in their stone wombs, and the brooding skeletons that were sealed in Gobi sand, and the family groups that died together in the ash and the flood, these survived. They survived 66 million years in the rock, waiting for a woman to put them in a coffee can and a paleontologist to recognize what they were. And from those fragments, carefully studied and thoughtfully compared and honestly interpreted, we have recovered something genuinely extraordinary. The first draft of a story about how an entirely extinct group of animals related to the young they produced. The story is not finished. Every new field season in the Badlands of Montana, and the desert of the Gobi, and the hills of Patagonia, and the red rock of southern China brings new material. New nests, new embryos, new associations of young with adults, new lines of chemical evidence about temperatures and metabolic rates and incubation durations, all adding detail and nuance and occasional revision to the picture. The picture itself will look different in 20 years than it does today, as it looks different today than it did in 1978, when Horner first crouched beside that nest. But the core of it, the recognition that dinosaurs raise their young with something that deserves to be called care, will not change. That is settled. That is in the rock. What the rock cannot tell us is what it felt like, from the inside. But we can, from the outside, observe the effects. We can see the worn teeth and know that something brought food. We can see the brooding posture and know that something stayed. We can see the bone histology of the young and know that growing up was a slow enough process that staying was necessary. And from the effects, we can reason backward toward the relationships that produced them. The relationship between a Maiasaura parent and its young was not friendship, not love in any sense we could confirm through biology, but it was something. It was a return, a recognition, a provision, an expenditure of energy and attention and risk in the direction of the small and vulnerable. Something that, whatever we choose to call it in the language of science, looks from the outside a great deal like care. So let us come to rest here, at the end of this long journey through the deep past. Let us let the science settle into the background for a moment, and simply be present with what it all means. You are lying in the dark right now, in a world built on a foundation of biological time that stretches back further than any mind can truly grasp. The house around you, the city or the countryside beyond your window, the civilization that produced the device you were listening to, all of it sits on top of a biological history so deep that its depths are philosophical as much as scientific. 600 million years of complex animal life on this planet. 230 million years of dinosaurs. 66 million years since the last non-avian dinosaur walked the Earth. 200,000 years since the first anatomically modern human stood upright in Africa and looked at the same stars you might have looked at earlier tonight. In that deep history, certain patterns repeat. They repeat because they work, because the logic of life in a world of predators and seasons and scarce resources keeps arriving at the same solutions, because the mathematics of offspring survival keeps selecting for the same behaviors in lineage after lineage across eons of time. One of those patterns is this: some animals stay, some animals return. Some animals invest in the specific young they produced, not in a generalized way, not by producing more offspring than the world will kill, but by attending to particular lives, by bringing food to particular mouths, by placing a particular body between a particular young animal and the particular dangers of a particular night. This is the pattern that we have traced tonight through the rock of Montana and the sandstone of the Gobi and the volcanic ash of northeastern China, the Maiasaura returning to its nest, the oviraptorid with its arms spread over the clutch, the Protoceratops family group, pressed together in their last moment, the Titanosaur colony at Alcamahuevo, the quiet industry of a nesting ground that operated every season for perhaps thousands of years in the hills of Patagonia. These are the physical traces of the staying, preserved by accident in rock that was once mud and sand and ash, and recovered by the patient work of people who knew how to read them. The thing about deep time is that it has the power to make everything feel very far away and very long ago and very irrelevant to the present moment. 66 million years, 75 million years, 100 million years. These numbers are so large that they lose their meaning, become mere symbols of extreme remoteness. Labels for a past so distant that it might as well be another universe. But the biology does not respect that distance. The biology runs through without a break. The oviraptorid brooding on its nest in the Gobi passes something forward to the next generation, which passes it forward to the next, and the next, and the next, through whatever lineages survived the end of the Cretaceous, through the early birds in the post-impact world, through 66 million years of avian diversification, and arrives, this evening, in the form of the birds that were moving through the air and the trees outside your home today. The connection is not metaphorical, it is genealogical. It is the literal physical inheritance of a behavioral system that began in an animal that no longer exists and continues in animals that are everywhere. There is a bird somewhere near you right now. Maybe not visible, maybe quiet at this hour, but near. It is a dinosaur in the most technically accurate sense. It carries the skeleton of a theropod modified over millions of years for flight. Feathers that are the direct descendants of the proto-feathers that insulated the coelurosaur ancestors of birds in the Jurassic. A reproductive system that has been making and attending eggs without interruption since before the extinction of everything you think of when you think of dinosaurs. If that bird is a parent this spring, or will be, then somewhere in the coming weeks it will do something that has been done continuously on this planet for at least 100 million years. It will return to where the young are waiting. It will bring what it found. It will stay a while. The vastness of geological time is real, and it is worth honoring. It is worth letting yourself feel it. The vertiginous depth of a past so long that every human event, every civilization and war and discovery and loss is compressed into the thinnest possible layer at the very surface of it. But the depth does not empty the past of meaning. The animals that lived in it were not diminished by their distance from us. They were fully alive. They were fully present in their moment, in their landscape, in their relationships with the young they produced and tended. The Maiasaura at Egg Mountain was as real as any animal alive today, as present in its own moment as you are in yours. Its attention on its nest as complete and as specific as any attention ever paid to any small and dependent thing. We know this because the rock tells us, not in words, not in language, not in any system of representation that required consciousness to produce. In the much simpler language of position and association and chemistry, the rock says, something was here, and something stayed, and the young were fed, and some of them grew up to do the same. That is the record. That is what was preserved. And from that simple, physical record, we have recovered something that is, at this moment, the night you are listening to this story, as true and as meaningful as it was when the first nest was dug into the late Cretaceous mud of western Montana, and the first eggs were laid in it, and the first parent moved to the edge of the nest and lowered its enormous body toward the warmth it had made. You carry this too, in whatever sense the biology of your own life allows it. The instinct to attend, to return, to provide, to place yourself between the small and the dangerous is not uniquely human. It is archosaur. It is Mesozoic. It is as old as the rock that holds the bones of the good mother lizard in the Badlands of Montana. As old as the sand that sealed the brooding oviraptorid in the Gobi. As old as the ash that buried the Psittacosaurus parent with its young. You are the most recent expression of something that has been expressing itself for an unimaginable length of time, and it will go on expressing itself after you, through the birds and the mammals and whatever lineages the future builds on the foundation that the present provides. Let that settle into you now. Let the depth of it be restful rather than overwhelming, because this is the other thing deep time can do. It can remind you that you are not alone in time, that you are not the first creature to have occupied the position you occupy tonight, that the space between a parent and a young animal that depends on it has been occupied by uncountable billions of living things across hundreds of millions of years, and that the world has always been, in this specific and enduring way, a world in which some things stayed. The Badlands of Montana are quiet tonight. The Gobi is cold and dark. The red hills of Patagonia are under a sky full of stars that the titanosaurs at Alcamahuevo also saw. The nesting grounds are empty now, full of rock instead of living animals. There surfaces the eroded evidence of an ancient world going about the ancient business of life. But the behavior that those nesting grounds represent is alive. It flew out of the Cretaceous on the wings of birds that survived what nothing else survived, and it has been airborne ever since, carried forward by every generation that raised a young animal to the point where it could raise its own. Sleep now. The ancient world is at rest in the rock, and the living world that descended from it is quiet in the dark, and the thread that connects them runs through the night without interruption, as it has for longer than any mind, human or dinosaur, has ever been able to hold. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.